Here's a question worth sitting with today. When is going back to an older technology smart, and when is it just going backward? Because the US just made a multi-billion-dollar bet on the answer, ordering its most advanced warships to tear out a cutting-edge system and reinstall one from the 1950s. And whether that's wisdom or nostalgia is genuinely, honestly debatable. Let's start on the deck of an aircraft carrier. On Thursday, President Trump signed a national security memorandum ordering the Navy to abandon the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, everyone calls it EMALS, on future Ford-class aircraft carriers, and go back to the old steam catapults that have been flinging jets off carrier decks since the 1950s. Let me explain what these things actually are, because the physics matters to the argument. A catapult is what accelerates a fighter jet from 0 to takeoff speed in about 2 seconds along a very short flight deck. EMALS does it with electromagnets, the same basic principle as a maglev train, which in theory gives a smoother, more controllable push that puts less stress on the aircraft. The memo says the change starts with the fourth carrier in the class, the future USS Doris Miller. And it also orders the ship's electromagnetic weapons elevators swapped out for hydraulic ones. Separately, and importantly, the same memo also allows the Navy to build some warships overseas, a big deal I'll come back to. Now I want to steelman both sides of this hard, because this is not a simple old dumb, new smart story, and anyone who tells you it is selling you something. Here's the strongest case for what Trump ordered. EMALS has a genuinely troubled track record, and this is documented, not partisan. The system had real reliability problems early in the USS Gerald R. Ford's life. The catapults and those electromagnetic weapons elevators suffered breakdowns and delays that the Navy has spent years working through. Trump's core complaint, which he's repeated for years, is that it's too complex, too expensive, and when it breaks at sea, it's fiendishly hard to fix. His line at a defense summit last month was that they spent billions of dollars more on electric catapults, and they're not nearly as good, too complex. And there's a real operational argument buried in there. A steam catapult is a known quantity. Sailors have maintained them for 70 years. If it breaks mid-deployment, the crew knows how to fix it. That's not nothing when you're in the middle of the ocean. So the case is proven, repairable, simpler. That's a real argument. But here's the critical case, and I think it's substantial. So let me lay it out fully. First, the cost and the timing of reversing course. Redesigning a warship that's already being built is enormously expensive and slow. General Atomics, the company that built EMALS, and which holds a $1.2 billion contract for the Doris Miller system, said the ship is already nearly 50% built, and that changing course now would introduce, in their words, significant complications, and that the decision warrants careful reconsideration. Estimates for the redesign run from hundreds of millions to potentially billions of dollars, and the Doris Miller already isn't expected to be delivered until around 2034, so you may be spending billions and adding years of delay to install technology from the 1950s. Second, and this is the part that should really give you pause, the data doesn't obviously support the idea that EMALS is a failure now. Here's the fact that cuts against the whole premise. As of March 2026, the USS Gerald R. Ford had completed 36,863 EMALS launches, nearly 37,000 successful catapult shots. And the Navy ran a test earlier this year, a 4-day intensive sortie generation test that reportedly beat the launch rates of the old Nimitz-class steam carriers. Now, in fairness, the Navy hasn't released all the data from that test, so I can't hand you a clean number. But it broke a lot when it was brand new, and it is broken now after 37,000 launches, are two very different claims. And the reversal seems to be arguing the first as if it proves the second. That's not the same as being fundamentally bad. And third, the strategic irony, and this is the one I can't get past. While the US is ordering its carriers to go backward to steam, its two main naval rivals are going the other direction. China's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, the Fujian, uses electromagnetic catapults, the same technology the US is now ripping out, and France's next carrier is planned around the electromagnetic system too. So the US pioneered this technology, ate all the pain and cost of being first, worked through most of the bugs, and is now abandoning it at the exact moment its competitors are adopting it. That's the part that turns this from a maintenance decision into a strategic question. There's an old saying that the pioneer takes all the arrows. The worry here is that America took the arrows and is now handing the settled land to someone else. So my honest take, I'm genuinely torn on the narrow engineering question. The reliability complaints about EMALS are real, and a simpler system a crew can fix at sea has real value. Reasonable defense experts disagree on this, but the timing makes it hard to defend. Reversing a nearly finished billion-dollar system to install 1950s technology, while China and France sprint toward the newer system, feels less like clear-eyed pragmatism and more like fighting the last war. And I'd add one thing to watch that got buried under the catapult drama. That same memo lets the Navy build warships in foreign shipyards. That's arguably the bigger long-term story, an admission that American shipbuilding can't keep up, so we'll outsource it. Going back to steam catapults is about the past. Building your warships overseas is about the future. More worrying signal. The question I'll leave you with, is this the confident pruning of a bad technology, or is it a great industrial power that's lost some faith in its own ability to build the new thing? And that theme, America trying to wall itself off from a problem, only to find the problem flows around the wall, runs straight into the second story, which is about a very different kind of leak. The White House released a report acknowledging something striking. The U.S. government is losing an estimated $19 to $26 billion a year in tariff revenue because goods are being rerouted around the tariffs. Let me explain the mechanism, because it's genuinely clever, and it's the key to the whole story. It's called transshipment. Say a product is made in China, and the U.S. has put a steep tariff on Chinese goods. Instead of shipping it straight from China to America, where it'd get hit with that tariff, the exporter ships it first to a third country, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico. There it might get repackaged, relabeled, maybe lightly assembled, and then it's shipped on to the U.S. stamped Made in Vietnam or Made in Mexico. Dodging the China tariff entirely, the report accuses China of, in the White House trade advisor's words, laundering its exports through more than 40 countries. And on its face, this is a real phenomenon, and the strategic point beneath it is legitimate and worth understanding. Here's the deeper issue the report raises. Over the past few years, U.S. imports directly from China have fallen. They hit a 16-year low in 2025. And politically, that gets sold as, the tariffs worked, we've reduced our dependence on China. But if a big chunk of that decline is just Chinese goods taking a detour through Vietnam and Mexico before arriving anyway, then the reduced dependence is partly an illusion. The goods are still Chinese, they're just wearing a different hat. Because it means a policy people believe is reshoring American manufacturing might, in part, just be rerouting Chinese manufacturing. That's a genuinely important critique, and it's coming from the administration's own report. But, and here's where I have to apply the same skepticism I'd apply to anyone's numbers, including a government reporting on the success of its own policy. Look at how shaky the specific figures are. The headline is $19 to $26 billion lost. That number is built on top of an estimate of how many goods are being transshipped in the first place. And that underlying estimate ranges, according to the report itself, from $34 billion all the way up to $303 billion a year. The low end and the high end differ by almost a factor of 10. They then picked a central case of $75 billion to generate the headline revenue number. So the confident-sounding $19 to $26 billion is really a guess built on a middle point of an enormously wide range. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but you should hold it very loosely, because a number resting on a 34 to 303 spread is more of an educated shrug than a measurement. There's a second layer of skepticism worth having, and it's about timing and motive. This report landed just weeks ahead of a planned visit by China's leader, Xi Jinping.
Reports come out when it's useful for them to come out.
A document accusing 40 countries of running a shadow transshipment network for China, released right before a high-stakes summit, is also a negotiating posture, a way of saying, we see what you're doing at the table. That doesn't make the underlying facts false. It just means the framing serves a purpose beyond pure accounting. And you're a sharper news consumer if you notice that. And here's the honest bottom line that connects it to our first story. Transshipment reveals the fundamental limit of tariff walls. Trade is like water. It finds the path of least resistance. You put a wall up between two countries, and the trade doesn't stop. It flows around through a third. Even Goldman Sachs, before this report, had estimated tens of billions in trade getting rerouted, and noted that transshipment is only part of the evasion. There's also straightforward mislabeling of goods to duck into lower tariff categories. So the deeper truth here isn't partisan, it's economic physics. You can make trade more expensive and more circuitous, but a determined global supply chain will reroute around almost any single barrier you build. The wall doesn't stop the water. It just changes where it flows, and creates a whole new industry of countries and middlemen who profit from the detour. My take? The interesting story isn't the tariffs are failing or the tariffs are working. It's that both can be true at once, and the transshipment numbers are too soft to declare either. What's genuinely worth taking away is the humility. A policy can look like it's working on the headline number, imports from China down, while the reality leaks out the side in ways that are hard to measure and easy to spin. Same lesson as the catapults, really. Be very careful about the confident story a powerful institution tells about its own big, expensive decision. All right, I've given you two stories about looking backward and building walls. Let me end with one about looking forward and building something genuinely new, because it's my favorite of the day, and it quietly reframes everything. Researchers at MIT and the University of Colorado Boulder just published something lovely in the journal NPJ Microgravity. They built the first comprehensive atlas. They call it HECIA, mapping how the physical design of a space habitat affects the mental, emotional, and social well-being of the humans living inside it. Here's the shift in thinking, and it's profound in its simplicity. When we design habitats for extreme environments, spacecraft, submarines, Antarctic bases, we design them almost entirely for survival. Will it hold air pressure? Will it keep out radiation? Will it not kill you? The MIT lead author, a PhD candidate named Mick Lynn, put it beautifully. We've come a long way from the human in a tin can. The point of this work is to design habitats for people to actually live in, not just barely survive in. So what did they do? They reviewed a huge body of scientific literature and interviewed experts from NASA, academia, and industry. And they mapped the connections between concrete design features, lighting, privacy, the layout of rooms, whether a space can be reconfigured, and 14 human experiences: anxiety, homesickness, fatigue, autonomy, nostalgia, curiosity, and how well crewmates get along. And they built it into an interactive online tool so that an engineer designing a Mars habitat can actually trace how a decision about, say, lighting might ripple out to affect an astronaut's sleep and then their mood, and then whether the crew fractures into conflict 8 months into a mission. Because that's the real danger of a years-long trip to Mars. Not just the radiation, but months confined with the same few people. No privacy, no escape, no normal day and night, far from everyone you love. Isolation and confinement wreck sleep, mood, and relationships. A mission doesn't have to fail because a machine breaks. It can fail because the humans inside break. Now, let me put my critical hat on even here, because I try to be consistent, and there's a fair caveat. This study didn't run a new experiment or discover a new fact about the brain. It's a synthesis. It pulls together and organizes existing research into a framework and a tool. A skeptic could say, this is a very well-organized literature review with a nice website. And that's technically fair. But I'd push back on the dismissiveness. Because organizing scattered knowledge into something usable is itself a real and undervalued contribution. For the first time, someone brought all this together and visualized the relationships, so a designer doesn't have to be an expert in psychology and architecture and aerospace all at once. That's genuine progress, even if it isn't a flashy new discovery. But here's why I actually wanted to end on this, and why it's the perfect counterweight to the first two stories. Notice what these researchers said about where else this applies. It's not just for astronauts. Lynn explicitly pointed out that the same thinking applies to submarines, oil rigs, polar expeditions, and in her words, even refugee camps or war zones. Think about that. The same rigorous, humane question. How does the design of this space affect the mind of the person trapped inside it? Could be applied to a refugee camp, housing people through the worst period of their lives. We spend enormous effort designing spaces for survival, and almost none designing them for dignity, for the human spirit. This little space study is quietly asking the question our whole civilization mostly ignores. What if we designed the places people are stuck in, not just to keep them alive, but to keep them whole? So let me tie all three together, because the thread surprised me. The Navy story is about a great power reaching backward, unsure it can build the future. The Tariff story is about a wall that can't hold, because the world flows around it. And the space habitat story is about a small team looking forward, and asking not just, how do we survive this? But also, who do we become? But how do we actually live well inside the constraints we're stuck with? And that last question is, honestly, the one the other two stories are missing. The catapult debate is all about the past. The tariff wall is all about holding a line, but the future doesn't belong to whoever best defends the old thing or best walls off the threat. It belongs to whoever keeps asking how to build something genuinely better for the actual humans who have to live inside it. When you see a big institution make a big decision this week, a government, a company, a military, ask which direction it's really facing. Is it defending the past, walling off a threat, or building something new and humane? Because it's easy to be dazzled by the size of a decision, billions of dollars, giant warships, sweeping trade policy, and miss the simpler question of whether it's pointed forward or backward. The most expensive choice in the room is not always the most future-facing one, and sometimes the most important work of all is happening quietly in a lab on a problem most people think is small. Take care of each other, and I'll see you next time.